Hi everybody, welcome to Polar Bears International's latest live chat from the tundra. I'm Alysa McCall with Polar Bears International, and we are joining you again this afternoon with Polar Bears just outside. It's been a beautiful day out here. I've seen some snapshots you're getting on the cameras. The sun has been amazing. The bears have been wonderful. We've seen mom and cubs over the last couple days. So keep us informed of what you're seeing out there, because you guys are seeing stuff that we don't too, which is pretty cool. So the topic that we're talking about today is STEM and how people are using different technologies to study polar bears, but also things related to polar bears. And we have the perfect panel here to talk about that today. I think it'll be a really cool chat, and we've seen a lot of people looking forward to it, including a STEM school from Texas, which is so neat. Thanks for joining. So first, before we get started, let's introduce our panelists, and we'll talk a little bit about their specialties so that people know what kind of questions to ask you. And remember, if you have any questions, please put them in that chat window on explore.org underneath the cam. So first off, Megan, could you tell our viewers a bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Dr. Megan Owen, and I'm a wildlife biologist from the Institute for Conservation Research at the San Diego Zoo. I focus on behavioral ecology, which means I study animal behavior and how animals interact with their environment. And this is particularly interesting now because the environment is changing so rapidly. And the polar bear is the perfect example of these changes, with the sea ice losses in the Arctic driven by our greenhouse gas emissions. Polar bear habitat is shrinking rapidly, and their behavior is going to be changing as a result. And we really want to understand how it's impacting the bears.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Dr. Nick Pilfold. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Alberta. I work on polar bears and seals, so my area of expertise is looking at predator-prey interactions, how polar bears use their environment, their space use relative to seals, what kind of seals they eat, and those things are all really important in terms of what we know about polar bears and what's going to happen to them with climate change.
Great, thanks, Nick. And Kyle, yesterday you guys didn't get to talk a lot to Kyle, but he does some pretty darn cool stuff, including working with NASA astronauts. NASA. So I'll let Kyle introduce himself.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Kyle Armour. I'm a professor at the University of Washington, and I study things like sea ice and sea ice loss under global warming, and those kind of things. So yeah, I work with NASA in the sense that I use a lot of their products, sea ice observations from space, those kind of things. Yeah.
Very neat. Well, thank you guys so much for joining. Remember, if you have any questions about technology, please let us know. I myself studied, actually, Nick and I started together at the University of Alberta, and I studied the polar bears in this population with their collar data, so I can also answer a few questions about that. And we already have questions rolling in, so maybe we can just dive right into them?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So let's start with this question first. What is the most surprising or unexpected thing that you've discovered using new technologies? And maybe we'll ask each panelist to weigh in briefly on that one. Who wants to start?
Yeah, I could start.
Sure.
So we've been using collar data in the Beaufort Sea and here in the Western Hudson Bay to do some really kind of neat analysis. So from the collars, we can tell when a polar bear is actually swimming. And this is a really important type of analysis because with sea ice change, we expect that they're going to be swimming more often and for longer distances. So what we've been able to do is extract these swims, and some really surprising things have come out of them. So I've been looking at swims in the Beaufort Sea. We found a subadult female who swam for a little over 9 days, covered more than 400 kilometers in that swim. So the subadults are quite a bit smaller than the adults. So that's a real surprising result to see a subadult swim that far.
No kidding. That's a lot for a young bear.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Who wants to weigh in next? Megan?
I'll just make the point that as an animal behaviorist, we use technology when we need technology. And one of the places we did use some technology was when we were looking at the hearing capacity of the polar bear. And this is a really fundamental aspect of their biology that nobody had a good sense of. And so we integrated technology from a range of disciplines, also working with bears in zoos and keeper trainers who could get the bears to do what we needed them to do. And we used technology and integrated it with animal behavior techniques to learn what they could hear. And we found that they had really quite good hearing, and that frequency went fairly low into the frequency range, which was really interesting to find out.
That is, we often get asked how well can polar bears hear, and you're kind of the person that
I know
helped
the
us
answer.
understand that. That's a great question for Megan. And Kyle, what kind of technologies have you used to learn?
Yeah, so I have to say I think a lot of my work is involved with using kind of older technologies like computer models that we've been using for a while and using them in innovative ways to study the climate system and doing things with them that people hadn't done before. But I have to say some of the most innovative things I've seen colleagues do from NASA, for instance, for one of the big limitations in studying sea ice has been that we haven't known sea ice thickness very well. It's really hard to get from point observations from ships. You're just seeing a particular ice flow and seeing the thickness locally, but to get a thickness over the entire Arctic, they now have techniques from satellites to actually measure the thickness of ice, basically bouncing radar off the surface of the ice or the surface of the water and measuring that difference. And that's given us a new outlook on the way sea ice is changing. We've basically seen thinning all throughout the Arctic at a high rate, all over the Arctic basin, and that's been a big surprise, I think.
That's interesting, and maybe it has implications for polar bears, which is something
Certainly.
we don't know, but there's been a bit of discussion on this buggy about what that might mean. And what's that old joke? How much does a polar bear weigh? Enough to break the ice? Depends on the thickness of that ice.
Yeah,
it's a pretty corny joke. It's a good one.
No, it's good.
So let's go to another question. So maybe I can start a little bit with this, and then you guys who have also done this can weigh in.
Sure.
So the question is, what is the process for putting a tracking collar on a bear, and how do you handle it differently if it's a sow with cubs? So we've been collaring female polar bears in this population since about the early 1990s, and it's simply when we go out and we find a female who's old enough, and they often do have cubs when they're collared, we will put a GPS collar on them, and the collar weighs a small percentage of the female's weight, and we slide it on so that there's room for her to take it off and breathe comfortably, and it's programmed to fall off within 2 years. Sometimes they fall off before that, if they decide they don't want it on their neck anymore. But this technology has just been so interesting and critical in our understanding of polar bear behavior and biology out on that sea ice, because we really cannot be following polar bears year-round on that sea ice. It's a really incredible tool. I get a satellite that emails me every 4 days letting me know the new locations, and you can see some of those on PBI's Bear Tracker. You can find that on our website at www.polarbearsinternational.org. We will follow bears in Western Hudson Bay. We used to follow some in the Beaufort Sea there. We'll do that all winter long, so you can tune in and take a look at what some collared bears are doing. And it's so interesting because they all do different things, and we're trying to figure out why. And so, Megan, one thing that you've been involved in is some collar cams,
Sure.
which are so cool.
Yeah, so there's a lot to learn in terms of the details of the behavior of the bears. And so as we get the data from the tracking collars, and we know where the bears are moving, but we don't know a lot of detail about what they're doing out there while they're moving. And with technological advancements, so instrumentation has become smaller and batteries last longer, and cameras. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of GoPros or used a GoPro yourself. And so modifying a little camera like that, it's called a point of view camera, and placing it on the collar that a polar bear is wearing allows us to see what they're seeing. And this is not my research. This is research with a colleague of ours out of the USGS in Alaska. But what he's finding is some really interesting things. For example, last year, one of the images his collar cam picked up was another polar bear right there next to him in the water. And that was a really exciting bit of information. And it's going to take certainly a lot of time and effort to get enough data from these type of collars to really tell us what the bears are doing. But it's a really amazing start, and it's all due to technological advancement.
Pretty neat stuff. Thank you for that. So another question about things that we put on polar bears. Someone is asking about the ear tags. How do the ear tags work? Is there any sort of technology associated with that, or are they simply for identification? Maybe Nick, you could start with that.
Sure, yeah. So for the most part, the ear tags that we've used in the populations are for identification. And that allows us to carry out abundance estimates in the population and figure out whether the populations are growing or shrinking or how they're doing. That gives each bear an identification number. And that's really important because unlike other large carnivores, some of them you can identify with marks. So if you have cheetahs or leopards, they have certain spot patterns, you can identify individuals. But with polar bears, that's really difficult. Maybe sometimes with the adult males, they might have scars on their face, or they've lost an ear and they've kind of gone Van Gogh from a bad fight. Then you kind of know that, well, I know that bear, I've seen that one before. But otherwise, you can't really tell who's who. And so that allows us to get in there and figure out what's happening to these individuals year over year.
Right. Thank you. And we do see some polar bears out here with those little white ear tags. I know many of you have spotted those on the cams before, and that means that a polar bear has been handled in this area, which is kind of neat. Okay, for the next question. So, true or false? Is it true that you can't put radio collars on male polar bears because their necks are too large and the collars would just slide off? And that is true.
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
I've heard, Andy DeRoche, who many of you met last week, he likes to call those big male bears pylon heads because they just have those thick necks and little faces compared to their neck anyway. So, Megan, this is maybe a good question for you to start with. How does it affect a polar bear to live in an area unlike the Arctic? So, for example, a zoo.
Well, it's a great question, and it's something that we wrestle with all the time with the bears that we do have in zoos, because their well-being is our primary concern. So we want them to be healthy and happy. And here we are in the Arctic, and we're telling everybody that polar bears need sea ice to survive. And it's not necessarily because that sea ice is cold. It's because that sea ice has ringed seals or bearded seals or other ice seals underneath it. So the polar bears need that sea ice to gain access to those seals that they need to survive. Of course, in a zoo, we're providing them with their meals, and we're making sure that they have an appropriate amount of calories and the behaviors that they like to engage in while they're looking for their food or they're processing their food. And so taking care of bears in zoos requires a real dynamic approach to integrating their natural history with an understanding that they are in a zoo and it is a different environment. So we just make sure by watching them closely and really monitoring their health that they're doing well, and that is always our primary concern.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. The next question, so this is kind of neat. How are each of the different STEM focus areas used individually and in unison with each other while studying polar bears and other Arctic wildlife? Well, that seems like an essay question.
Yeah,
Maybe
that's
a college admission.
That's a
PhD
serious
candidacy
question. Does anyone want to take a stab at that? And actually, Kyle, I'd be interested to hear from you definitely for this one as well. I can repeat the question if needed.
Yeah, STEM involves a lot of things.
Yeah.
I can speak only, I guess, to my own work in terms of integrating those things. And I have to say, a lot of mathematics is involved in terms of studying sea ice and studying the climate system. A lot of physics is involved. A lot of technology is involved. But I think maybe more importantly, there's a lot of collaboration across disciplines. And so because we're studying the climate system, we're studying something that's so complex and involves so many different aspects at once. You can't do it yourself. You really need collaborators to study the ocean, the atmosphere, the sea ice, measure things from satellites, measure things from the ocean. You need basically across all disciplines to be collaborating, working together to actually understand things. So I'd say collaboration is actually a key part of STEM.
Absolutely.
I could chime in there a little bit too. I think working in the Arctic in particular, you have to combine a lot of different fields at once because you're really out here. You got to be a little bit self-sufficient. You're not close to a lot of things. So you might think of yourself as a scientist. I'm just a biologist. But as soon as your snow machine breaks down, well, now you're an engineer, right? So you're combining things that you might have learned along the way to get the job done, and certainly technology because, like you said before, with the collars. They've allowed us to follow bears into environments and during times of the year where we'd never be able to get focal observations. So without that technology and those advances, we wouldn't actually be able to understand the species to the degree that we do today. So there's definitely an integration across all those fields.
Right.
And then when it comes to mathematics, I lean on my friend there, Kyle, to help me out and other people that are good that way. So the collaboration part is also really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Megan,
Absolutely. Well, it goes back to that collaborative approach that Kyle mentioned. Being able to integrate technology where you need it to study what you're out to study, being able to count on the engineers and the mechanics and the other types of support that you need to work in a remote area like this. It's all about bringing those tools together and really understanding how and when you need to apply those tools. So there's no STEM tool that isn't valuable out here.
Absolutely. And I think that one of our best examples for this question is PBI's BJ Kirchhofer, because BJ did a degree in photography, came out here, has become our absolute technical, internet, everything genius. He's the one that gets Buggy One going. And now he's also heavily involved in a lot of research projects with polar bears, including the maternal den stuff that you're involved in, Megan.
I mean, that kind of thing is huge for what we do, because as a biologist, I'd like to conceive of a question, but I don't have the skills necessarily to implement what I would like to do. So having people in science who come to it from a very different approach is what makes us successful. And we really need to be to understand that you can be involved, you can be a part of science without necessarily being a biologist or a physicist. There's really a role for everybody.
Absolutely. And that's one of the cool things that comes out of these panels that we have with Polar Bears International every fall. Is it's largely to talk to people out there, to you guys, and tell you a bit about what's going on in the world of science and polar bears. But it's also become this really great opportunity for scientists from all over the place to connect with each other, meet each other, brainstorm ideas, and start new projects. So collaboration is definitely the key. You can't specialize in everything, so work with other specialists, and that's pretty fun. Kind of in that vein, and this might be a tough question, but I think it's really important. How is the information that you collect on North American polar bear populations shared with researchers in other countries, and vice versa? How do we get information to each other?
Well, that's a really good question, because polar bears are circumpolar distributed across the Arctic, so they share territorial overlap. So the population that I work in South Beaufort, is overlap between Alaska and Canada. And so I work with teams from Alaska and from Canada when we want to do something like what a population estimate. So the population I'm talking about that's on the screen right now is that light green one that's overlapping Alaska there. It comes into Canada. And if we were to figure out how many bears are in that area, well, we have to share information across borders. So we got to start to work together and talk to each other. So usually that happens initially, with person-to-person contact. We decide what we're going to do, who we're going to work with, the team that's exactly going to be involved, and then from there it flows quite easily. I mean, the technology today, we can easily send information across to one another.
Excellent. Anyone want to add anything?
Well, I think one of the key things that Nick just mentioned was communication. So it's about being willing to collaborate, of course, through communication, knowing how to write and how to respect others in your field and in different cultural frameworks. I think that's a really important part of collaborating. And it's true for many wildlife populations that overlap national boundaries.
Absolutely. And another way to share some information, there's the Polar Bear Specialist Group, and they get together from all different countries. I think the next meeting is coming up next year, just before a big bear conference. At the conference also there will be a lot of networking, and that's been a really great way to share information. A few of us at PBI were just at the Wildlife Society conference in Winnipeg a couple weeks ago. There's some really wonderful polar bear talks, and you learn a lot. And you're just seeing what people are up to, and you got to keep in touch with people these days. Luckily, social media is making that easier. I know our Twitter feed is usually pretty full of polar bear stuff too, so lots going on. Okay, so the next question. Okay, and I don't know if you guys can answer this, but I think this is pretty cool. How do you use engineering in the process of what you do? So, does anyone have...
Well, I think if we go back to the collars and the different types of instrumentation we can now put on the collar is thanks to engineers making those technologies more compact and longer lasting. And so now, we really need to consider the weight of that collar, and it's relative to the animal's body weight. But as the instrumentation has gotten smaller, we can put more things on there, and that means we can learn more about bears. And that's a really, really important thing. Especially when you consider that bears are in these incredibly cold environments. They're underwater a lot of the time, so that engineering is really, really finely tuned to what we need from a polar bear's perspective.
Yeah, I think I'd add to this that the general theme here, I think, so far today has been all about collaboration, right? And one of the things that's really important to understand is that there's so much information in each person's individual field that you can't know it all, and you really need to rely on other people. So when it comes to engineering, I'm not much of an engineer, but I do know what I would need from a biologist perspective to get the information that I want. So then I can talk to an engineer and they can tell me how that's going to happen and how it's going to materialize in the real world. So for people who are out there, students who are looking to work on polar bears, you don't just have to be a biologist to work on polar bears. You can be an engineer, you can be a mathematician, you can work on technology. There's a lot of different routes to getting there, and I think sometimes people just think of it in a strict sense of it's an animal, so I need to be in biology, and that's definitely not true.
Very true. Very true. Very true that it's not true. Kyle.
So I think I'm in the same boat here. I'm not much of an engineer myself, but a lot of what I do is look at large climate data sets, which are put together by a combination of scientists and engineers. A lot of engineers at NASA, for instance, to put up a satellite, to put instruments on that satellite. Also a lot of engineers, some of my colleagues at the University of Washington, have floats in the ocean and gliders in the ocean that can basically go down and follow ocean currents, go to depths of a few thousand meters and measure ocean temperatures and salinity and those kind of things. Those are all really valuable data sets that I use after they process them and put them out for the public and researchers like myself. So there's a lot of engineering that goes behind the kind of synthesis and understanding of the climate system that I like to work in.
Excellent. For any young students watching out there who might be interested in science or technology or animals or whatever it is, just really the sky is the limit. There are so many neat things you can do, neat people to work with. We have so many questions that need to be answered still. We haven't even scratched the surface really on what's going on, and it's really exciting to think of all the possibilities and talk to young people who are really stoked to learn about polar bears and just how to learn about them. If anyone is interested in looking at some educational resources that we have. Yesterday, one of the webcasts that we did for our Tundra Connections program was using technology to crack the curious case of the roller bear. And it was a lot of fun. There was a Discovery Education Challenge that went out with that. So several questions that get kind of your math and science and creative thinking skills going. And you can do that challenge and then watch the webcast to learn about roller bears and how people use technology to study them, but also other animals too. So that's pretty cool.
I learned a lot about roller bears.
There you go. Yeah, we all did. We all learned a lot about roller bears. Okay. Do you find it easier to track and follow the polar bears through technology or just by following them in the wild?
Oh, that's an easy one to answer. So I go back to what I said when I introduced myself, and that as an animal behaviorist, as a behavioral ecologist, if we can learn about an animal just by watching an animal, that's the technology we're going to use. We're going to use our eyes and a pad and a pencil. But polar bears are roaming over vast areas of the Arctic sea ice. It is nearly impossible, if not downright impossible, for a person to actually observe a polar bear while it goes about its natural behavior. So without technology, we have no idea what's going on with polar bears out on the sea ice. So it is absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm. I can't imagine how tough it would be to track a wild polar bear for any length of time. And they move. We'll see one just walking on the horizon and you think, oh, it's just going for a stroll. And before you know it, it's right by the buggy. Like they can cover ground.
A lot of ground.
A lot of ground. Huge home ranges.
Or they can walk away from the buggy sometimes too.
Oh, well, of course, yeah, they always
happens.
end up just walking the opposite direction. Someone was asking earlier if people whistle at the bears or try to make sounds to get them. That is highly discouraged.
Yeah.
And I don't think they'd really care that much anyway,
No.
unless anyone has like a really good dying seal call, but I don't think that
They just ignore you
happens.
when
Yeah,
talking to them.
they're
They
not
just
really,
ignore the
they're more
yeah.
olfactory, I
Yeah,
think,
yeah.
for what attracts them, and none of us really smell, again, like a dying
seal.
So,
Luckily.
yeah. Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully we don't. I don't know.
Maybe at this point in the week.
A few more days. Yeah.
Oh, funny. Do we name the polar bears when we find them?
I don't think we officially name them. We when a polar bear when a polar bear gets its collar, there's an identification number that's associated with that collar, but that's not a name. That's just a way for us to track that animal and the information we collect from that animal. However, I think when you come up here year after year, and you do start to see some bears that you think you might recognize from previous years, and you do start to attach names to them. I think we've actually attached a few names just today to some bears whose behavior was pretty distinctive. So no formalized naming, but we do name them.
Right. And we see on the explore.org chats too, sometimes when those guys have very distinctive features. So we mentioned Van Gogh, our Van Gogh bear who's missing an ear. Victor is a popular bear around here. He has the V-shaped scar under his eye. So those guys we can kind of tell, but it's, pretty hard to identify sometimes and keep track of who is who out here. Well, here's a good question, and I should have done this right at the beginning of the webcast. What does STEM stand for?
Is it science, technology, engineering, and math?
Yes. Yes, science, technology, engineering, and math.
Yeah.
Just all-encompassing science and using those tools to study the world around us. So thank you for pointing that out.
Very good question.
Excellent. Okay, so this is neat. I'm going to go to every panelist for this one. Maybe I'll start with Kyle. What is your educational background? Did you study science and math in school?
I did. I studied science in the form of physics, and I studied mathematics in undergrad. And then I went to do a PhD in physics and started doing particle physics, and then learned a bit more about the environment and about sea ice, and I became obsessed with sea ice, and so I kind of diverged into that career path. And so science through physics and mathematics was kind of my trajectory in, but I really didn't know about climate until much later, and then made that switch over.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I myself also studied biology, animal biology, and then ecology for my degrees, and really enjoyed it. And math was definitely a component of that, but largely on the biological and ecological side of things.
Yeah, my path was a little bit similar to Kyle's over there. I actually started out in physics in undergrad. I wanted to be an astrophysicist, but the mathematics wasn't really compatible with me. But I have a lot of math in my background. But I decided to switch over to ecology when I took ecology course by chance. I had to fill it as a requirement, and I forgot how awesome ecology was, and that actually changed my path in undergrad. And then from there, I continued on to do ecology as my PhD.
I had a really different path than everybody else here on this panel, and I actually started off as an arts major. So I never even dreamed of having a career in science, and I studied art and liberal arts. And then at a certain point I decided I wanted to do something that would make a difference and that could help people. So I became a pre-med major. And then I had an opportunity to come up here to the Churchill area and do a research project, and that just changed everything for me. So having an opportunity to be out here in such a magnificent place, to see polar bears and wildlife up close, and to really start to understand how beautiful our wild places are and how important it is to preserve them, that turned me into a wildlife biologist, and I've never regretted that choice.
Pretty darn cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. I didn't know you started out in arts.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, there really are a lot of paths. One thing I took a lot of in school was writing courses.
Yeah.
Writing for
Really
science,
important.
English
Yeah.
writing. Clear communication helps in any field you're going to go
Absolutely.
into.
Yeah, if I can interject
Yeah,
here, I
please.
think that's actually something that's really missing in my own personal education. I spent a lot of time learning math and physics, and when I got to graduate school, suddenly had to write papers and communicate results, and I didn't know what to do, and I relied on my advisors to really help me through that. But I think writing skills in particular
Yeah.
are so important. Even
So
if you want to be a scientist in the STEM fields, you have to learn how to write, and you have to learn how to communicate your results to people very clearly.
Communication.
Communication is
Essential.
key.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, guys. Are engineers working on finding a way to track male bears without using a tracking collar? So there have been attempts made, definitely. We've tried some ear tag trackers, we've tried some glue-on trackers. They last for a short period of time before those males like to rip them off. We've also been in talks on certain occasions where kind of ideas have not really gone anywhere. But there's a lot of ideas out there. There might be someone working on something right now I don't know of, but for any of you students or adults who think you might have a cool idea and want to see it through, we would love to hear from you. That would be really great. Do you guys know of any real
I-
movements made towards
I
that
think you
now?
covered them. I don't.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's about it, but I
Yeah.
think the
Yeah.
need is really
Oh.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what a place to put your creativity.
Yeah.
It's pretty important. We have these decades of movement data for females and cubs, and the poor males, we'd really like to know what they're doing out there. So yeah, put your brains together. That would be super helpful. Oh, this is interesting. With technology, do you know if a polar bear is sick or unhealthy? Megan?
That's a great question. And actually, I think we can infer whether they're doing well to some extent by their movement data. I think we have enough data at this point to sort of understand the standard trajectory of a polar bear moving out there on the ice and how much ground they might cover. But there should be some refinements we could make to the data that we're getting from the collars, or the types of instrumentation that would allow us to have a better sense of what's going on. There have been there's a long history of research where they've looked at polar bear tissue and assessed the toxicity of that tissue, and that's given us a real better understanding of how many pollutants the polar bears are exposed to when they're out there in the oceans and the sea ice environment.
And I think some of you this last year who were watching the Explorer.org Bear Tracker Bear Aurora, there was a bit of concern about how she was doing because her collar stopped moving. But considering her age and what we knew about her when she was collared and her movements, we are pretty confident that that collar simply slipped off and wasn't moving, and there's really no reason why she wouldn't be doing great right now. And we still haven't heard from her. I promised everyone we'd update if she was captured again or seen. She hasn't been, but I'm sure she's out there, and her cubs are, out there too, and we'll keep you guys updated, and we will be tracking more bears this year, so stay tuned to that. Any tips or advice for students who may want to do what you do as a career? Again, you want to go through the panel, Kyle?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just follow your passions. That's really what gets you where you are. If your passions are my career, then follow those and stick with them. And I think just doing the things that most interest you and going after the problems you're most excited about, asking the questions, then finding the skills that allow you to kind of solve the problems you're most curious about. That's really the way to proceed, I'd say. And that may lead you in a different direction than what you initially thought it did for me. But that was a good move to kind of keep going the direction that is keeping you up at night, thinking about the problems you want to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add, if there's something you're really interested in or you think you are, volunteering if you can. Volunteering really led me to my current job now. I volunteered with all sorts of animal projects, and then when I was a grad student, volunteered with PBI for several years before working for them. And it's a great way to network, to meet people, to make good impressions, to learn about yourself, and if you're well suited for the job. So I think that's maybe something that would be good if you're interested in this field. Yeah, try it out.
From my experience, I would add in that it takes a lot of hard work. That's just the truth of it. You can't get around that fact. And sometimes when we see somebody in a career that we want, it seems like they took a very easy, short path to get there. But the reality is nobody takes an easy, short path, and the reality of the path is a little bit more difficult. So don't give up on it. You got to stay with it. You got to work hard at it, and it'll come. It will come as long as you work hard at it. And it's surprising to me in my own life how many opportunities I've been able to get just from hard work, and I'd just say that's definitely part of it.
Absolutely.
I absolutely agree with what I just said. He stole my answer.
Oh, no.
I'm so upset. But I would also say, there's a famous saying that if you want to do good, you have to do something. So good intentions are a starting point, but action is what makes the difference. And so if you have an idea, and if you're passionate about something, put your hard work and your education behind it and do something.
Oh, thank you guys.
Yeah, I would just say one more thing about that, which is I think definitely hard work is part of this career, but it doesn't feel like work sometimes when you're really excited about a problem, which is another reason to kind of follow your passions and make that you make it your hobby to do your work in some sense, right? But all three of us, four of us do, right? That's,
Yeah, definitely. When you love your job, getting up in the morning is pretty easy. So, okay. Interesting. Again, people are pretty curious about this tracking conundrum. So one of the questions is, are subcutaneous tracking chips being developed since they could potentially last longer than collars?
I think one of the issues with subcutaneous tracking chips is you have to be careful in the population you're deploying them on. I would assume, I'm talking a little bit out of my depth, that you would have to remove them at some point. I don't know if they're, you're putting them subcutaneously into the skin, you may have to remove them again, where the collars have an automatic release and they just drop off. So if that's the case, then with the collars that we deploy, we don't worry if the bear's in Russia or something like that and it's gone over there and we're never going to see it again because the collar automatically comes off. So I certainly would be concerned a little bit about the recapture requirement if we needed to take the...
Are there certain populations that would be better for, say, Hudson Bay bears staying more
potentially
local?
Yeah,
okay.
Because we get Hudson Bay bears on land all the time, so there's a higher chance that you get recapture, and if you could have a sort of a radio attachment to that device where you'll be able to focus in on the bear from aerial transmission, then you'll be able to go and get it. But yeah, it's an interesting question for sure.
It is. I know one of the technologies being used with some animals is the pit tagging.
Right.
So having a little tag under or attached somewhere, very, very tiny. They even can do it with fish. And if that animal then goes by a reader, it reads who that animal is or what they're doing. And I don't think we're quite there with polar bears because we don't have, so for example, they can be used in bats, so you'd pit tag a bunch of bats in a cave and then put the reader around the bat cave hole, and when the bats leave in the evening, it reads all the bats, and then when they come back, it reads the bats. So, I mean, it could maybe work at this time of year when we have these tundra budgies,
I was just thinking,
right?
this is a great idea.
They're coming up
Put a
to the
reader here in
budgies.
Churchill.
That would be kind of cool, but if we're looking over 5 countries and 19 populations, it's probably not a widespread solution, but I mean, it would be pretty cool. And that's, I think, where a lot of projects actually start in STEM, is a bunch of people sitting around being like, you know what would be super cool if we did this, and then it turns into something or a new technology, or I don't know.
I think the biggest limitation with the tracking devices right now is the batteries. The batteries are the heaviest
Especially in
part
the
of the
Arctic.
collar,
Absolutely.
and because of the cold conditions in the Arctic, batteries don't last as long. And we need to get that information to satellite. Like I said, some of these collars drop off. We'll never actually be able to get the data from the collar unless it's transmitted through a satellite. So then you're talking about having an antenna, enough power to be able to transmit between the satellites. So I think it'd be a little bit of work with the subcutaneous tags to get them to that point where we could actually remotely get that data. And that's super important for us, is to be able to have that.
Right. Very good point. So this is a good question. I think we've probably noticed a few. As the behavioral ecologist, I might shoot this one to you. Have you noticed any consistent behaviors as you observe these polar bears?
Oh, it's actually been so fun to watch these bears do their thing out here. And something Nick and I have been seeing quite a bit of is some of the bears doing this pounce behavior that is sort of typical of what a bear does when they're breaking into a seal lair out on the sea ice. And we see sort of a lot of warming up for life out on the ice behaviors out here. So that kind of pouncing behavior and a lot of digging around in the snow. We've seen some sparring behavior, which is this sort of play fighting between males. And that sparring behavior is incredibly important for males to develop their strength and to let other males have an idea of what they're capable of. And just a lot of investigation. And we also, when the bears are out here, they're coming off many months of not having eaten anything. So the other, the thing that's underlying all of these behaviors is the idea that they're trying to conserve their energy, and that they are always sort of on the razor's edge when it comes to energy at this time of year. So anything they do, you have to wonder why they're doing it, because a lot of the bears are also just hunkering down and really conserving their energy.
Thanks for that question. So we're getting close to the time we'll start wrapping up, but we'll still take some questions that we have here and maybe just try to, well, not rapid fire answer, but we'll try to, I think we can get through a few of these and give you good answers for them. One is, do you ever have the occasion to locate polar bears that have died and done necropsies? We are able to do that sometimes. It doesn't happen all the time. Many of the polar bears that pass away will do it on the sea ice, and so we actually think the bottom of the ocean would be a great place to find polar bear fossils, and that's why we probably don't have a lot of polar bear fossils. But for example, this summer we did locate a dead polar bear. I did take samples from it. There was also a chunk of grizzly fur in that polar bear. Maybe a grizzly had wandered by. It probably didn't kill the polar bear, but maybe it had a snack or at least checked it out or something. And we send those samples into certain areas that then will do the DNA and try to figure out what's going on with that polar bear. So unfortunately, we don't get to do that a lot because necropsies are really useful for figuring out what's going on. Another question, how many polar bears do you have trackers on? So this will vary by population. So right now, the Western Hudson Bay, I believe 9 new collars went out this year. We still have some working from last year. Southern Hudson Bay put out a bunch of new collars this year, so they have maybe up to like 15-ish right now. Southern Beaufort Sea,
Those programs on the Canadian side have wrapped up, so most of those collars have dropped now. But we do have some collars that are out in Viscount Melville Sound, so that's a little bit north of the Beaufort Sea. We're into more of the Canadian high Arctic there. There was a field program over the last 3 years that just ended last year, and there was collar efforts done there. So some bears that are transmitting from there.
Right. Okay. And we're the Canadians, so I'm sure there's a lot going on in other populations, but it's not a huge amount considering the polar bear population size. It's very expensive to track these bears, and so we only do a small number every year. But right now, at least we're getting a little bit of good data from the Hudson Bay area. And again, check out our online bear tracker. We aren't tracking every single collar, but a good amount from the population, and you'll get a really good idea of what's going on out there. Question for you, Kyle. Do you have any updates for us on the condition of the sea ice right now?
In Hudson Bay?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, what we saw coming in just over the last couple of days is a little bit more freeze up just along the coast of fast ice, and I think that may have been spurred along by the strong winds we had on Sunday night when we first got here. Really strong winds, a lot of evaporation, cooling those sea surfaces, and basically creating more sea ice because you're cooling down and actually freezing that water. But over the rest of Hudson Bay, it seems like it's pretty ice-free right now, and I don't know how long it's going to take to freeze. That has a lot to do with what the weather's going to be over the next couple of weeks. So right now it seems like there's a band of sea ice right along the coast, but it's not very wide, and the rest of the bay is ice-free.
Right.
Up until you get pretty far into the north, and you see some sea ice coming down from the kind of more central Arctic.
As
but,
expected.
yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
And we don't see any right where we are right now, but definitely the first signs are showing that the sea ice will be more present soon. But again, it depends, and it's really hard to predict when that will happen. But I'm sure the Bears are, looking forward to the next couple weeks here, watching the bay every day.
Yeah, they're ready.
They are ready. Yeah, some of them are very ready. Have you ever had polar bears lose their trackers? And if so, what do you do to find them? Most of the time the polar bears lose their trackers. We very rarely recover them. That's why having those satellites that let us know the information are so important, because there's a pretty good chance we're not going to get those collars back. Actually, we got one back this year. I think one back last year. So usually when we put a collar out, it's kind of a lost cause for ever getting it back. And that's okay. That's kind of built into our budgets and our knowledge. But if we can get one back, it can be really valuable because it might be able to log some of that in-between movement that we can then extract. So, we kind of just shrug our shoulders if we lose one. There's nothing else we can really do about it. Okay. What types of technology do you use to track the population of polar bears? So we have talked about the collars. Maybe we could talk about, do you know much about the DNA side of things, tracking over time, or the cortisol stuff that's going on, tracking stress over time, kind of anything?
Well, as far as cortisol is a hormone that people study in a variety of species, and it can be an indicator of stress. And because we know some polar bear populations are undergoing nutritional stress because of sea ice losses, because due to climate change, we're interested to see if they are in fact suffering nutritional stress. But the problem is with cortisol is that in bears, because they go through these long periods without eating anything, the cortisol can go up sort of as part of the natural dynamic, because what cortisol does, and this is why we see it when an animal is stressed, is it mobilizes fat stores and it gets the metabolism moving. And when a bear is going through a long period of fasting, that's something that's going to show in its cortisol levels. So we're working now with zoo populations of bears to study cortisol dynamics and understand what the natural dynamics are in an unstressed population of bears. And then we can take that and interpret cortisol data that we've collected from wild bears. And of course it's much more challenging to get cortisol data from wild bears, and some scientists are using hair that they capture from the bears to look at cortisol levels, or you can potentially look at it in feces, but all of these are very, very challenging, and it's highly technical. And so that's just an example of how we might collaborate through different levels of science to better understand what's happening in a larger population.
In that vein, because within that you mentioned a bit about this, can you tell if a polar bear changes its diet? Could we pick that up with a certain type of technology?
So, I think that's something that a number of scientists have been using stable isotopes to study the diet of polar bears and other animals. And again, it's just so cool. I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but when you can't watch an animal do what it does, how are you going to know what it's doing? Well, these scientists are looking at the different ratios of carbon isotopes in tissue or hair samples, and through that they can tell whether they're eating food from a land-based source or a marine source. And these are really important things to understand with a species like the polar bear. And it is sort of like wildlife CSI. You know, when you can't see what's going on, you have to take clues from what's left behind in the environment or what you can capture from that animal to try to piece it together after the fact. It's really cool.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about the diet stuff a little bit?
Sure. I mean, the one way I've been looking at diet is through kill remains. So we can go out on the sea ice and we'll see a seal that's been killed. And so technology comes into that because what we do is we go down and we collect a sample and we'll take DNA for that so we can determine what species of seal was killed, what the sex of the seal was, whether male or was it female. Then we also look to extract the jaw and take the teeth out, and we'll section those teeth up really thin, put them under a microscope. And when you look at the teeth under the microscope, there's a section of the teeth called the cementum, and they put down new annuli every year, almost like tree rings on a tree. And you can count those up and you get an age for the seal. And so that's really important because then we can start to look at, okay, this seal was this old, it was this type of seal, it was probably this size, so that's how much biomass was available to that polar bear. And then you can start tracking that over time, and if you want to link it back to population trends, you can start looking at, well, in this particular year we saw a lot of big seals being killed, and it looked like the population was doing really well. So we can start to link those two mechanisms up. So yeah, like Megan said, it's CSI, it's awesome.
That is super cool. Polar bear CSI. Okay, here's kind of a neat one, and I might ask all of you briefly to chime in. How do you organize all the data that you collect, and do you share this between colleagues, and do you publish it in scientific journals? Kyle, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, so I organize all the data. Mainly the data I collect is really model output, computer simulations of climate change, for instance, and we store those on servers at the University of Washington locally. But what we do is we publish that data and we make it available to people who ask for that data, if they can use those in some way. And for the most part, I also use a lot of data that's collected by other people. As I mentioned earlier, the colleagues that are measuring things from space, from satellites, measuring things in the ocean. A lot of these are all available. You can just go online and do analyses from them. You just have to know where to look for them, really.
Cool.
But they're all publicly available, and they're incredibly useful tools for researchers.
That's awesome.
Yeah, collecting data is certainly a big component now, and we're entering what a lot of people call is a big data time for science, which is that there's huge streams of data, and we're maybe not on the largest side of that. I mean, I think in genomics and stuff it gets much bigger, but if you think about a number of bears that are sending you signals 6 times a day, and that's going on with 10 collars over years, it gets to be a lot. So one of the processes that are really key for scientists is to be able to establish databases that are capable of easily accessing that information and being able to run analyses on it. And certainly publication is a huge part. So here today we're giving outreach, we're talking, but that's one component of a scientist's job. The other component is to make our results available as much as possible, get those things out into the literature so people can see what we're seeing.
Absolutely.
Sort of to expand on what Nick was talking about, because of all the technology that's gone into data collection techniques, from camera traps to acoustic monitoring, we're collecting more data than we ever had before. And so one of the things that people are developing more and more is pattern recognition software. So when you have these incredibly large databases, it would take thousands of hours to go through that data that's been collected to extract the information. So, but if you can get yourself, a good mathematical engineer to write you a program who understands what you're looking for and can interpret your biologist's goals in a mathematical way, you can do that automatically. And that's been a huge boon for many of the technologies we now so willingly deploy in our work.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys for chiming in on that one. Let's just take 1 or 2 more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately. This is kind of neat. Has STEM allowed you to witness behaviors that you haven't seen previously?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I would go back to the swimming example for sure. I mean, the deployment of collars and able to define what a swim is and what's going on out on the sea ice. We didn't really realize how far these bears were going, and until we actually had that technology, it was certainly surprising and allowed us to see those observations.
I think for many of us too, using camera traps in different parts of the world for different species, cryptic species or nocturnal species have always been a huge challenge for biologists to understand. But through using camera traps and the engineering that supports their deployment, we're now learning about animals and their behavior in a way that we just have never had the potential before. And there have even been new species discovered in certain remote corners of the world. It's really a great time to be a scientist.
Very cool. What about sea ice behavior? Is that what you call it?
Yeah, I was going to say something about how I've been studying polar bear behavior for about 5 days now.
Yeah.
Through STEM. But yeah, so sea ice behavior, that's a great point. Absolutely. So new satellite technologies, for instance. Those have been really critical in terms of understanding what's been happening. So those came online. The earliest ones, I guess, in the 60s, a few satellites went up and saw some sea ice. Then later in the 1979, or so since then, we've had continuous records. But the more recent satellites by folks at JPL, for instance, looking at the sea ice thickness, that's told us a whole lot about the dynamics of how sea ice, how it's spinning in different regions, those kind of things. And then, of course, climate models. So bigger supercomputers, for instance, at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, they have a supercomputer we use a lot to run climate models on, and learning about the sea ice dynamics within climate models that are more sophisticated now than they've ever been before is really the way I do the research. Yeah.
That's pretty exciting.
Very cool.
And even with technologies like the Explore.org live cams out here, you guys are getting a look into polar bear behaviors. I mean, if 10 years ago, there's no way that the average person sitting in their living room could get insight into what polar bears are doing on the tundra. But look at you guys. I'm always seeing cool insights and tips or comments on what's happening out here. And it's just really neat to see the technology to even stream this from the tundra into town, out to you all over the world is pretty cool. And another cool thing that we are going to be doing in the next few days, we have a Google Trekker mounted on Buggy One right now. So you can't see that, but we will post some pictures, I think, soon. Oh, we also have a polar bear visiting right out on the other side there. But this Trekker, we're going to be driving Buggy One around the tundra and taking it all in and redoing an expedition out here. And we're going to be marking down where the polar bears are. And then this will be going out to the public so that people can take their own tour of the tundra, pretending they're in a buggy and looking for polar bears. I think we'll also maybe be doing a town tour to see the town of Churchill as well. So stay tuned for that. It should be fun. We might be doing some outreach around it. We'll keep you guys informed as to what's going on. And yeah, technology does just keep getting cooler and cooler every year. Cool. Well, let's just take one last question and then we will wrap up. And this one is just about these bears, and how long have we been studying these bears for and how?
Well, I think we've been studying this population for close to 40 years now, so it's one of the longest studied populations anywhere in the world. And that's occurred in a variety of ways. So we've already talked about the collars that we put out, but some of the earliest studies were actually observational studies that looked at diet, that collected scat and looked at what bears were eating. And then we had studies that looked into the population. So started marker capture studies here in the 80s and tried to figure out how many bears live here and what's the trends over time. So this population has created a lot of knowledge for us about what polar bears are doing and how we understand polar bears around the rest of the Arctic, for sure.
Right. And this was actually one of the first populations where we were able to tie a decrease in sea ice to body condition. And so these were really, some of the canary in the coal mine polar bears. When they first started studying polar bears out here, climate change was not on the radar at all. And it was just over a couple decades, the biologists that were coming back year after year after year were noticing things going on and took a look at the data and the sea ice data and the climate stuff and the polar bears and realized that, hey, there actually is a connection here. And it's just so logical now. Polar bears need that sea ice to hunt, and if we lose sea ice, we'll lose polar bears. And we want to make sure that that does not happen. We want to keep them around Hudson Bay and across the Arctic for many years to come. And thank you for everything you are doing to help us with that. Polar Bear Week last week was a big success. And this isn't Polar Bear Week, but polar bears continue to be here, and they will for a few more weeks, so keep staying tuned. They didn't get the memo. They had a really good time last week, but they're still hanging around for more, I guess. And so this is, I think, our last official live chat from Buggy One, but I'm sure there will be more to come. This is the time of year when we see how the season plays out. So please keep in touch with us. Let us know what you're doing for polar bears. You can tweet us at Polar Bears, check out our Facebook or Instagram pages, check out our website to learn more about them, how you can help them. You can sign our petition for a carbon tax in the United States, or you can just get involved at home however you want. We have those Paris climate talks coming up in December. There's a big social media push to that. One cool thing trending right now is the Earth to Paris hashtag, which we've been involved in. It's pretty fun stuff, so check that out if that's your thing. And yeah, we will stay in touch. Thank you for being such a wonderful community. BJ might be going out to Cape next week. We might try to get him and Haley Shepard back on cam. We'll see if we can work that out. And it looks like also a Chris Morgan chat might be in the works here for tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. And thank you so much to our sponsors, of course, explore.org, as always, for everything they do, for getting these cams up and running, and so much more. Also to Frontiers North Adventures for donating us Buggy One and letting us do this cool stuff out on the tundra. Also helping us put up those lodge cams. To Parks Canada for assisting with those Cape cams, and also so much more. And the Churchill Northern Study Center, who's got that really cool Northern Lights cam. And tomorrow on one of our Tundra Connections webcasts, we will be looking at the Churchill Northern Study Center. If anyone is interested in the kind of stuff that goes on there and the research they do, maybe one of you will stay up there one day doing your own research. That would be pretty neat. So thank you for joining us, and don't go anywhere for the next couple weeks because we're still going to have polar bears, and we will talk to you really soon. Thanks for your questions. Bye.